In my last video I made these cedar chairs for our deck, and now it's time to make a matching table. The reason I made the table second is I wanted to make sure that the chairs would fit under the table in width and in height. So the dimensions of this are really designed around the chair size. And just like the chairs, this is designed to be built out of 2x4s and 1x6s of cedar. The reason for that is that there seems to be a glitch in the matrix in the pricing of these boards. They're about a third the cost of other cedar lumber, things like 4x4s and 2x8s. So this first section is really building some essentially 4x4s out of 2x4 lumber. You can see what I'm doing here is gluing two 2x4s together, and I also reinforce them with some screws. If I had to do this all again, I probably would build my own 4x4s, but I would likely not use screws. Those screws tended to get in the way. I would have just trusted the wood glue. Here I'm using a plug cutter, and then using the bandsaw to cut those plugs free, and those plugs are to hide the screw holes. Again, if I did it all again, I would just use glue. I wouldn't use these screws. It's a little bit overkill. But I would build my own 4x4s in the end. It ended up saving about $300 in material cost, and it was kind of a fun project. Here I'm using a flush cut saw to trim the dowels and then sand them down. This was a bit of a production in the shop, building a bunch of 4x4s. They really ended up being 3 inches by 3 inches, which in the long run saves some weight on the table as well, as opposed to using regular 4x4s. I took them over to the table saw and trimmed them up so they're nice and square. And you see here I end up with 3 inches per side. Alright, now that we've built the raw lumber, give it a good sand, and now we have the pieces to build the base of the table. So the entire base is built out of 3x3 lumber essentially. Back over to the chop saw, I cut all of the lumber to the final length. For example, the legs were 25.5 inches. Get all 4 of those the same. And then cut a couple of cross supports for the ends of the table. All of the joinery on this was using this dowel max. It's a new thing, got off Amazon. Works really well. I've enjoyed it. It's very accurate. It's quick. Once you get used to it, there's a learning curve, like with everything. But once you're used to it, it's great. Here's a shot of gluing up the end of the table. Obviously there are 2 ends. Just wood glue and dowels. Assemble it all together. And get some pipe clamps to squeeze it while the glue's drying. This is the point where I realized that the screws I had inside the boards would get in the way when I drilled dowels through the ends. So I had to do some creative planning to get around that. Again, if I did it again, I'd leave those screws out to avoid that issue. Once the ends are done, it's a similar process to connect the ends with 4 spanning blocks. You can see 3 of them laying on the table there. It's a single dowel that I drill from the edge, and then I had to make a small jig you see here to index the second hole. I tried several different ways to clamp this table. My clamps were not long enough. I ended up using all of the ratchet straps that I had, and this was a fantastic solution. It really pulled everything together, it kept it square, squeezed all the glue out. I was really happy with the way it worked. You can see the final strapping configuration I had there, and a close-up of one of the joints where you can see how tight they were pulled shut. Now that the base is done, just a final rounding of the corners using a small handheld router and a 1/4 inch roundover bit. And I spent a couple of hours just flipping the table in different ways and rounding every corner that I could get to. After we're done with all the roundovers, we give the entire base a quick sanding. I use 120 grit on all of this. Same that I used for the chairs. It seems to be a good medium grit. And after the sanding, we give it a quick wipe down with teak oil. The intent here is to give it some protection outdoors. maybe keep the cedar from graying too much. And finally I put a few plastic feet on the very bottom, just to stop the ingrain from sitting in water if there are puddles on the porch. And with the base done, it's time to move on to the tabletop. I start by cutting some boards to 30.5 inches long. These will be the center boards. They'll have tongues cut in them, you'll see. Then I laid them out on the table, and with an accurate measurement of 5 credit cards gap between each, got a measurement for the width of the table. Then I cut these 2x4s to that width, ended up being 28.25 inch long, and I put a dado blade into the table saw to cut a 1/2 inch slot into the middle of each of these. Now this 1/2 inch slot will accept the tongue of the boards that were cut earlier, so I adjusted the blade to cut the tongue you see here. So the 2x4s have an inch deep slot down the middle, and the 1x6s have a 7/8 inch tongue. You can see here I'm sanding it just to tune it a little bit, and it's a nice fit. At first I did that fit a little too tight. I ended up going back and sanding them a little bit more to make it looser, because I found when I did table assembly, it was really hard to get everything in the right place at the same time. The final piece of the puzzle are the edge boards. Those are 68 inches long, and this is the first time I've test fitted here to make sure that the center boards, when the tongue is inserted into the 2x4s, it'll fit and line up with those edge boards. It needed a little tweaking, but it looked pretty good. Then while I have access to every parts of the board, I put on a layer of teak oil. This gets those inner surfaces that I won't be able to reach once the table's assembled. And this is a short video of a complicated assembly, trying to get all of those boards inserted into the 2x4s, aligned with the edge boards, glued up, and gapped as well. This took a couple of practice runs before I got it right. And you can see pipe clamps used in 3 places. Once the exterior frame is pipe clamped, then I go through with the credit cards and set all the gaps. And then from the bottom of the table, there's a single screw that holds each of the boards in place. The intent here is to not have the boards slide around in their slot, but give them room to expand as the seasons change. Final step is attachment of the tabletop. What I did is drill a through hole for, I think, a 3.5 inch deck screw. I used a piece of board clamped under it to prevent any breakthrough. And then I countersunk those screws from beneath the table. And with everything in the shop, there's a final sanding I did to make sure that all of the glued joints had a nice transition. It really didn't take much sanding. Came together well. Once the sanding was finished, I gave it one more layer of teak oil to the top to replace the teak oil on areas where I had sanded. And that's it. That's the full table. Here it is installed out on the porch with the chairs. The design came together nicely with the 3x3 boards for the base and the 1x6 cedar board top. We'll get years worth of enjoyment eating meals out here. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks.